In the NBA, I feel like the definition of being in a full-on rebuild is when you are going into next season and your number one priority is not winning as many games as possible. If you're more focused on either tanking for a high draft pick or developing your young players, then I'd say you're still in a full-on rebuild. Today, we're going to be ranking those teams that are still in the middle of that rebuilding process based on how good I think their future is as of right now. Before we get into this, some of the things that I'm looking at are obviously like the players that they have, but also like what picks they have and how good their front office is. I'm also putting a lot of weight on how good like your best couple of prospects are, more so than like the quantity of young prospects you have. Because almost every one of these teams has a ton of young players, but what it really comes down to is how good is your best guy, how good are your best couple of guys. Obviously there's a balance between that, but you get what I'm saying. So it's really a list of who's in the best spot as a rebuilding team going forward as of right now. That being said, let's just get into it. At number 8, I have the Charlotte Hornets, and I think they need a little bit of an asterisk by them because while I think they are in the middle of a rebuild, they also are trying to win, which works at their disadvantage, trying to be 1 foot in one door and 1 foot in another. They have the build of a rebuilding team in the sense that they have LaMelo and they've got a lot of other young guys, but with Gordon Hayward and Terry Rozier on the roster, they're still going to be competitive. And with Steve Clifford, who's known for getting teams that are maybe borderline into that 8th seed, they're definitely going to win maybe more games than you'd like them to. Not saying they'll make the playoffs, but losing Bridges has everybody very low on the Hornets, and rightfully so. But they're not as doomed maybe as one would think. I think LaMelo is like a pretty good number one. Who's got a lot of room to grow. And I think the odds of him leaving are probably a lot less likely than people think, at least in the next couple years. And on top of that, they've got a general manager in Mitch Kupchak, who granted probably only has a couple years left before he takes a smaller role on the team. But they've got a general manager who's drafted well and some young prospects you can be excited about like Kai Jones and Book Knight and JT Thor, Mark Williams. You can see the way where they figure it out. But now that they've lost Bridges and the fact that they're not going to be bad enough to have a super high pick, their path to getting way better is essentially just what? They need Kai Jones and Book Knight and JT Thor. They need all the young guys to pan out, and they're going to need to hit on all their draft picks. And while it's not totally unthinkable, they do that at a high percentage. You got to be a little bit realistic and know not every single one of your young players is going to be great. So I have them pretty low on here, kind of because they're not even really like a true rebuilding team. They're just maybe a team that should be and could be if they made a couple of moves. At number 7, getting into the true like rebuilding, not trying to win this year teams, I have the San Antonio Spurs. And they're this low not because I have some problem with something that they've done. I think they've just now, like obviously this year, decided that they're going to go through the full rebuild, meaning that they're kind of behind a lot of the other teams still. I like some of the prospects they've drafted. I really like the Shohan pick. I'm excited for Keldon Johnson. They've got a few guys on the team who I think are going to be worth watching this year, but they definitely don't have somebody you see as a future number one, at least not on a super, super competitive team. And that's fine. They know that. I mean, they're going to be tanking this year. They're going to be bad. They're going to hope for a high pick and a really good draft class. If there was a year to decide to tank, this is definitely the one to do it. But as of right now, I think they're behind most of the other teams that are going into a rebuild because they've just started. Also with Greg Popovich, we don't know what the situation there is. I mean, he's got to be headed towards retirement here sooner rather than later. The only major move they made was the DeJounte Murray trade, and I understand why people didn't like that one, but I think he would have kept them too good, and I don't think he was their future number one. Getting 3 firsts from him and being a worse team that has a chance to have like that super high pick in the lottery is a move that I agree with, but it certainly pushes their timeline way, way, way far into the future. So it's going to be a little while for them. They're taking the right path. They're making some smart moves, I think, but they're still a ways away. And number 6, I have the Indiana Pacers. And this is another team that's also very recently decided that they were going to blow it up. And I've really liked what they've done so far. I mean, the Tyrese Halliburton trade was one of the better trades I've seen in a while in terms of just like, yeah, that team won. They did a great job getting what they got for what they gave up, right? And I'm super high on Halliburton. Outside of Halliburton, they got Benedict Mathurin. They've got Duarte from last year. I'm a really big Jalen Smith fan, too. I'm glad they were able to retain him. But as of right now, I don't know if they have their number one either. I also think they don't have a ton of assets to move to go get extra picks outside of what they've already done. I think Miles Turner and Buddy Hield will end up getting moved, but if that nets them too much more than one, maybe two first, I would be pretty surprised. It's so tough to rank these teams right now, like the Pacers and the Spurs, because a lot of it comes down to what they can do in next year's draft. Like, for instance, right now I have the Pacers at 6th, but if they were to win the lottery, or even if they didn't and they just hit on a star player on their next pick, they'd be set for a long time. So this is another team where I think just getting into the rebuild and the fact that when they started rebuilding, they didn't have, a crazy amount of assets compared to maybe some other teams that started a rebuild when they were like a really strong competitive team, does put them a little bit lower on this list. But that doesn't mean, again, that I think they've made any like egregious mistakes. In fact, I think the Pacers front office has done a pretty good job, and I agree with a lot of the moves they have made. This is just the type of thing that takes time, and they've got to hit on like a real number one. Or have Tyrese Halliburton step up and be that player, which isn't impossible. At 5, I have the Utah Jazz. And I understand having them over the Pacers when the Pacers already have Halliburton is maybe a little bit unfair, but I think I might rather be Utah right now. They have 17 first-round draft picks, I think, in the next 7 years, and they're not even close to being done, I don't think. Jordan Clarkson, Malik Beasley, Bogdanovich, Mike Conley. These are all other vets. I think there's a real possibility they trade for more first-round draft picks. So what they've done is they've basically put themselves in the same situation that the Thunder have. And while, because they just blew it up, they don't really have like the high-level prospects on the team yet. I think having those 20 first-round draft picks, I think that's the way to go. They're hopefully going to be a terrible team next year. They could have 3-4 first-round draft picks in a fantastic draft class. They do have some nice young players, Vanderbilt, Walker Kessler, Colin Sexton on a really nice deal for 4 seasons, I think could be big. So it's not like there's nothing to watch going into next season for them if you only care about how their young players develop. But I think with Danny Ainge running this, but Ainge has a relatively decent track record of, he picked Tatum, he picked Jaylen Brown. He's done it before. So I just think having that wealth of picks is such an advantage and puts you in such a good spot to be an elite team that I've got them at 5. But I can understand if you'd rather just have Halliburton and not all those picks. Coming in at number 4, and I think we're finally starting to get into like the top tier of rebuilds. These next 3 are all very close to me, is the Orlando Magic. And their rebuild has definitely been maybe not underrated, but underhyped. I haven't heard enough people talking about it. I really like the Bencharo pick. I'm super excited for Paolo. Wagner was super good last year. Jalen Suggs wasn't what you wanted him to be, but if he can turn it around even a little bit with what they've got going right now, I'm super excited. On top of that, Wendell Carter's super good. Cole Anthony's somebody I'm excited for. We're going to see what Markelle Fultz has this upcoming year. They've got a lot of guys. Now, the one thing that keeps them a little bit lower on this list is that I don't think Wagner is like their future number 1. And I understand the idea is that Paolo is going to be him, and I do believe in him, but we haven't seen him on the court yet. Whereas with some of the teams above Orlando right now, I've seen the guy who they have as their number 1 on the court play at, a level where I feel confident about them. So I'm going to go and give the edge to those teams. But Orlando is an overall pretty good spot. They don't have a ton of extra picks, but they've got a couple. And this Chicago Bulls pick that they have next year, I don't think there's a guarantee that that's not a lottery pick. I think the Bulls could totally miss the playoffs and they could end up with 2 first-round, lottery picks in a year where the draft is going to be super good. It's supposed to be a super good class. I think another thing that worries me a little bit about them, and this is kind of a dumb one, admittedly, I think that they may win a few too many games to be one of like the highest odd teams for the lottery this year. And that's not a huge deal, but in a draft class this good, you would rather see them like competing for Wemby. I'm worried that they're going to win like 32 games because they've got a pretty talented roster that I think can win some games this season. So I think that puts them at a little bit of a disadvantage versus maybe a couple of the other teams where I think the roster is still more so incomplete. I mean, we're talking about rosters here that are, 25 games versus 30 games you're going to win. But I think those two things have kept them down a little bit for me, on top of the fact that their big, most important player hasn't played a game yet. But if in 40 games, Paolo looks really great, all of the young guys are trending the right way, but they've only won 7 games, we'll be talking about Orlando as having arguably the best rebuild of any team in the NBA. So I'd be super excited for them. At number 3, I have the Houston Rockets. I'm a huge Jalen Green fan. I think he's the guy. I think at some point in his career, he's going to be scoring champion. And on top of that, not only do I like the prospects that they have outside of him, Şengün, Kevin Porter Jr. turned it on at the end of last year. I really liked the Tari Eason pick. Jabari Smith, I'm not crazy high on, but I understood the pick. But I think at 3, it made sense that he was a pick there. But it also makes me feel good about them drafting going forward. And they've got a lot of draft picks. They've got 3 next year, again, and a super good draft class. And while they're missing some of their own picks, which I think is pretty bad for a rebuilding team, not having your own draft picks means that tanking does you no good. They do have Brooklyn's. And while Brooklyn didn't implode this year like you'd want them to, I think by 2027, Brooklyn's going to be not very good. So you could see, I think by 2027, Brooklyn probably projects to have, fallen off a little bit. They can only keep this up for so long. And if that is the case, which it might not be, but if that is the case, they could end up as one of these teams that's very, very good and then suddenly gets like a top 5 pick out of nowhere. So I've been a huge fan of a lot of the moves that they've made. If they keep drafting the way that they have been and Jalen Green turns out the way we want and a lot of the other prospects they have turn out the way that we want, I think they're going to be very, very good. I'm excited to see more Kevin Porter Jr., Jalen Green, Şengün minutes together. Even if Walker isn't a star player, the skill set that he has obviously is going to translate into at least a very good NBA player, you would think. And again, Tari Eason was one of my favorites. I was actually pretty disappointed. Remember the Hornets? I'm a Hornets fan. You remember the Hornets had 2 first-round draft picks, and they traded one of them away. I thought the move was going to be Mark Williams and then Tari Eason as the other one. So I'm really, really excited for what they've got going there. If anything, they're going to be fun to watch with Jalen Green. And number 2, I have the Detroit Pistons. I'm very high on the Cade Cunningham, Jaden Ivey duo. I'm in a dynasty league. We were drafting today, and I picked up Jaden Ivey in the rookie draft. So that's my vote of confidence for him. I think that Cade Cunningham, of a lot of the young guys, he's the guy you're probably the most confident in being that number 1 playmaking, scoring, offensive option, and that's the most important thing that you can have. On top of that, Troy Weaver is a fantastic general manager. I really like the way he's drafted recently, and that makes me feel good about the moves they're going to make going forward. If Ivy turns out the way you want, you've already got your 1 and 2 right there. But Jalen Duren was a nice pick. I'm excited for Isaiah Stewart, and I think Sadiq Bey is going to be really, really nice this next year too. The other thing that is super big for them, and I guess I haven't really checked on like exactly how much cap space some of these other teams are going to have, but I was taking a look at it, and the Pistons are going to have $70 million in cap space next year. And even if they don't go out and like sign a bunch of players, that's going to give them the ability to, take on bad contracts for assets and things like that. So the fact that they have a number 1 who you trust and you're like, this guy has MVP potential. The fact that they've drafted super well, the fact that they've got all that money, and the fact that, they've still got that great general manager puts them really high for me. I think they get a lot of hype on Twitter. I think rightfully so. So I've got them at number 2. But again, honestly, I wouldn't be shocked if you had them at 4. I think Orlando, Houston, and the Pistons are all really close, and how these next few draft picks pan out for them is going to make all the difference and where you would rank them at like the end of the season. So I think they're all within striking distance of each other. But that brings me to number 1, and that's the Oklahoma City Thunder. I think that Shea is fantastic. I think that Chet Holmgren is going to be fantastic. I know he got hurt, but when he plays, he's going to be fantastic. Those, I feel like, are 2 cornerstone players that they're going to be able to build around for a long time. But then they also have all the draft picks like Utah does. So they've got the best of both worlds, and they're going to probably be terrible this year and have another shot at another high pick. They're one of these teams where you look at them and you look at the assets they've got, and if things pan out their way even a little bit more, you could see how it starts to get out of hand how good they could get, right? Like, what if they do win the lottery next year and they have Shea, Chet, and Wembanyama? What if they hit on any of the other draft picks they've had this year? Jalen Williams, what happens if Josh Giddey turns it on and becomes like a serious offensive option? There's a lot of ways where if they have Shea, Chet, and then another guy pan out, and then they also have 15 draft picks that they can trade on top of that, they could go make 2 of these like blockbuster star player moves and have an absolutely like loaded starting 5. And on top of that, you've got Sam Presti, who is one of the best talent evaluators in the NBA. I do think that Presti has been very boomer bust with the way he's been drafting, and maybe that's caused them to lose a little bit of value. Like, he'll take a shot on the guys who are going to be great or nothing. But I think eventually that's going to work out for them just with how many picks they have. And when it does, I think they're going to be in a pretty ridiculous, unstoppable situation. They've also got some other guys. I'm also obviously like a big Lou Dort fan. And Trey Mann is somebody I'm super high on to be like a 6th man of the year type player down the line. But I just think having Shea and Chet as your 2-star players, Shea is really so efficient. He's a great playmaker. And Chet, I think, could be a defensive anchor. And I'm not as worried about the weight as other people. So having those 2 guys already and the picks and the great GM puts them at number 1 for me. I think that about does it for this video. Let me know what you guys think in the comments, what ranking you guys would have. Do all the other stuff you're supposed to do on YouTube videos, like and subscribe, and I'll catch you guys next time.